In Okinawa during 1945, young soldiers faced questioning. They belonged to the Taketsu Kinotai student units. Teenagers were armed with grenades and simple weapons. They had been sent against advancing American forces. Imperial policy demanded sacrifice from its youth. The war's desperation showed in their expressions. Their silent faces revealed more than testimony. On England's south coast in 1962, rescue crews worked frantically. They pulled the final survivor from a wrecked trawler. Massive waves and sharp winds battered the scene. The struggle against the sea lasted for hours. Many fishermen were not as fortunate. Icy waters claimed countless lives over time. The ocean always demands its price. In Houston during 1955, Ella Fitzgerald faced arrest. She stood beside Georgiana Henry at the station. They had performed before an integrated audience. Authorities objected to black and white patrons seated together. The singer was handcuffed for crossing racial lines. Music challenged segregation more powerfully than speeches. That night, jazz confronted injustice directly. Along the Hejaz Railway, an Ottoman supply train rests abandoned. It was ambushed by forces linked to Lawrence. More than a century has passed since the attack. Desert sands preserved the wreckage in place. The site feels like an open-air museum. Here, time seems strangely suspended. Some chapters of history remain unmoved. Uncle Fed was born in 1792. He died in 1907 at 114. His life spanned 3 different centuries. He witnessed the Industrial Revolution reshape society. He lived to see slavery abolished. Oil lamps gave way to electric lighting. Napoleon had not invaded Russia at his birth. By his death, airplanes already touched the sky. In London during the 1910s, suffragettes faced force. 2 policemen restrained a detained activist in a park. Women demanding the vote were treated as offenders. Many were arrested and publicly shamed. Some endured force feeding while imprisoned. Despite repression, their movement refused to yield. Persistence eventually secured voting rights. In Paris during 1910, floodwaters reshaped the city. Streets resembled canals more than avenues. The Seine rose over 26 feet. Water entered museums, metro tunnels, and homes. Residents traveled by boat where they once walked. The city of light turned into waterbound streets. Recovery required months of drying and repair. Around 1915, Field Marshal August von Mackensen stood prominent. He was among Germany's most effective commanders. His cap bore a skull emblem. The symbol reflected Prussian military tradition. Death signified duty and honor in that culture. He embodied an older martial world, yet he fought within a modern industrial war. In New York during 1953, commuters rode quietly. A newspaper strike had halted publication for days. Typographers' unions clashed with publishers in dispute. For 11 days, presses remained silent. Millions lacked their usual daily news. Subway riders traveled without folded papers. The train cars felt unusually hushed. In Turkey during 1925, sweeping reforms accelerated. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk prohibited the Ottoman fez. He aimed to modernize and westernize society rapidly. A new law mandated European-style hats. Traditional headwear became illegal overnight. Those who resisted faced possible imprisonment. The change symbolized a broader cultural transformation. In 1936, a farm family prepared to leave. They packed belongings onto a worn vehicle. Drought had devastated the Great Plains. Poor farming worsened the spreading dust storms. Fields turned barren and towns choked in grit. Thousands abandoned homes seeking survival elsewhere. Many headed west for work and dignity. They were often labeled Okies regardless of origin. In 1942, American posters urged shared rides. Wartime propaganda targeted everyday drivers. Traveling alone was framed as wasteful. Fuel conservation became a patriotic duty. Saving gasoline supported soldiers overseas. Each gallon spared strengthened the war effort. The battle began even behind the wheel. In Germany during 1976, Joachim Kroll faced police. He reenacted murders during the investigation. The killer was known as the Duisburg Cannibal. Remains blocked plumbing in his apartment building. Discovery came through a maintenance complaint. Neighbors had considered him quiet and ordinary. Horror had lived behind familiar walls. In 1945, Europe's war had finally ended. American nurses sailed home across the Atlantic. They relaxed beside an anti-aircraft gun. Months earlier, they had worked under bombardment. They treated wounded soldiers amid constant danger. Now sunlight replaced the sound of explosions. Peace arrived gently on the ocean waves. In Anchorage on March 27, 1964, disaster struck. A 9.2 earthquake shook Alaska violently. It remains the strongest recorded in the United States. Streets split apart beneath stunned residents. Vehicles teetered above sudden chasms. Structures crumbled during 4 relentless minutes. Tsunamis battered distant coastal communities. More than 130 lives were lost. In Los Angeles during 1948, women trained with revolvers. They were new recruits within the LAPD. Policing then was dominated by men. These trainees challenged long-standing barriers. Each shot on target proved competence. They claimed space in a guarded profession. Their presence signaled lasting change. They were pioneers wearing the badge. In London during June 1940, bombs rained down. The Blitz reduced streets to smoking rubble. Amid ruins, civilians paused for tea. Cups were lifted despite shattered buildings nearby. Routine became quiet resistance against fear. Comfort came in small, familiar rituals. Even as the world trembled, tea time endured. In Greenland during 1912, survival became a trial. Explorer Einar Mikkelsen endured years trapped in ice. He remained with his companion, Ivar Iverson. Isolation stretched across 2.5 years. Hunger and hallucinations tested their sanity. Rescue seemed distant and unlikely. When finally found, they appeared barely recognizable. On December 14, 1911, Roald Amundsen reached the pole. He planted Norway's flag in Antarctic snow. His team beat the British expedition by weeks. Robert Scott arrived later with heavy disappointment. Scott and his men perished returning home. Success and tragedy were separated by timing. Preparation and fortune shaped their fates. In Kentucky during 1946, Dillard Eldridge sat with his children. They gathered inside a modest 4-room house. Monthly rent cost only $9. The Belva coal mine had closed after an explosion. Work vanished, leaving families without steady income. They remained in aging homes built decades earlier. Hope lingered for jobs that would never return. On Everest in 1996, Beck Weathers was presumed dead. Teammates and rescuers left him in the storm. Hours later, he regained consciousness in darkness. Nearly blind, he forced himself to stand. He staggered through brutal cold toward camp. Frostbite ravaged his face and hands. Several fingers were later amputated. In Paris during 1956, police detained several women. They sat confined inside a transport vehicle. The arrest followed a crackdown on prostitution. Some remained quiet, holding uneasy composure. In Drenthe during 1936, a rural family posed. They stood before a house built from grass and peat. The dwelling was modest, yet carefully constructed. Life there demanded endurance and steady labor. Despite hardship, their dignity remained visible. Years later, The Netherlands would symbolize prosperity. Back then, farmers shaped homes from the earth. In 1889, veteran lumberjacks tackled massive trees. They worked with axes and relentless determination. Each towering trunk demanded strength and precision. Safety measures were minimal or non-existent. One mistake could end a life instantly. The labor seemed reckless and often proved deadly. In Japan during the late 19th century, samurai assembled. They faced the camera with solemn composure. Modern reforms were reshaping their ancient order. The warrior age was stooped by industrial change. Firearms and factories replaced swords and armor. Within decades, blades became ceremonial relics. Bushido survived mainly as memory and tradition. Off the coast of Korea during the war, surrender unfolded. 3 communist fighters approached in a small fishing boat. Moments earlier, they had been armed adversaries. Now they lifted their hands in submission. Conflict had fractured nations, loyalties, and families. In that instant, ideology seemed distant. They were simply exhausted men seeking survival. In Beijing during 1958, crowds gathered at the Summer Palace. They banged pots to drive sparrows from the sky. The action followed Mao's 4 Pests campaign. Rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows were targeted. The effort nearly wiped out the birds. Without sparrows, insects multiplied unchecked. Crops suffered severe damage across fields. Famine followed, claiming millions of lives. On the Chukchi seacoast in 1976, a rare encounter occurred. Explorer Nikolai Michulik approached a polar bear. He offered food to her and her cubs. Trust briefly replaced fear in the Arctic wilderness. The Soviet North was usually harsh and unforgiving. Predators there rarely tolerated human presence. The scene felt almost unreal against that backdrop. In Colorado, on April 20, 1999, tragedy struck. A Columbine student, Dustin Gorton, collapsed in grief. He learned the attackers had been his friends. 13 people were dead, the nation stunned. Shock spread through classrooms and communities nationwide. He faced a haunting, unanswered question. How had the warning signs gone unseen? During the 1990s, a sporting legend shared a quiet moment. Soviet water polo star Petr Svenoridze held his grandson. The Georgian powerhouse once dominated Olympic pools. Opponents had feared his strength and presence. Now he cradled the next generation gently. Time softened the champion's fierce image. Stories of triumph would outlive his playing days. In 1933, prisoners labored outdoors under supervision. An armed guard stood watch nearby. The scene was photographed by Doris Ullman. Her lens often focused on marginalized communities. The image captures discipline, hardship, and quiet endurance. In Kentucky during 1946, Dillard Eldridge sat with his children. They gathered inside a modest 4-room house. Monthly rent cost only $9. The Belva coal mine had closed after an explosion. Work vanished, leaving families without steady income. They remained in aging homes built decades earlier. Hope lingered for jobs that would never return. On Everest in 1996, Beck Weathers was presumed dead. Teammates and rescuers left him in the storm. Hours later, he regained consciousness in darkness. Nearly blind, he forced himself to stand. He staggered through brutal cold toward camp. Frostbite ravaged his face and hands. Several fingers were later amputated. Against all odds, he survived. On the Western Front during World War I, soldiers experimented. They tested an observation post shaped like a tree. Trenches stretched from the Channel to Switzerland. Hidden within bark, men watched enemy movements. War demanded grim and inventive solutions. The disguise appeared strange, yet proved effective. Such devices spared lives amid relentless fighting. On August 3, 1970, history shifted in Mississippi. The state recorded its first legal interracial marriage. Just 3 years earlier, such unions were crimes. The couple faced the camera with steady resolve. They had crossed barriers many wished intact. Legislation evolved faster than public attitudes. Hostility lingered despite the legal victory. In Port-au-Prince on May 15, 1963, troops marched. They paraded before Haiti's National Palace. It marked the end of François Duvalier's term. Instead of stepping down, he seized greater power. He declared himself president for life. Authority tightened as democracy receded further. In Pennsylvania, on August 30, 1963, tensions erupted. White teenagers shouted at the arriving Baker family. They were the first black residents in Delmar. Anger twisted young faces in open hostility. Neighbors united to force the family out. Despite intimidation, the Bakers refused to leave. Time would judge who stood on justice's side. In London during 1936, crowds praised Jesse Owens. He had claimed 4 gold medals in Berlin. His victories shattered claims of Aryan superiority. The world watched Nazi ideology lose credibility. Abroad, he was honored as a sporting hero. Back home, segregation still restricted his freedom. Triumph on the track did not end discrimination. In Sweden during 1918, hardship lingered in fields. A mother and daughter searched the stubble. They gathered remnants left after harvest. The practice was known as gleaning. It offered the poor a fragile right to survive. Even prosperous nations faced hidden hunger. Scarcity touched lives beyond public pride. In Tulsa during 1921, smoke covered Greenwood. The district was known as Black Wall Street. White mobs attacked the prosperous black community. Homes and businesses burned across dozens of blocks. More than 35 blocks were destroyed. Hundreds of residents lost their lives. For decades, the massacre was minimized in textbooks. Saul Syorn worked for the tobacco industry for decades. From the 1920s to the 1960s, he tested cigarettes. His job required constant smoking and evaluation. He inhaled thousands over his career. He died at 70 years old. The company had long understood health dangers. He seemed unaware of the full risk. In Bombay during 1958, a boy posed quietly. His name was Farrukh Bulsara. He was 12 and unknown to the world. Years later, he would be called Freddie Mercury. His voice would reshape modern music. Convention would bend before his stage presence. The future icon was already waiting. In Paris during 1957, a young designer stood solemn. Yves Saint Laurent was only 21. He attended Christian Dior's funeral. Dior had dominated French fashion. Few expected the quiet successor's impact. Soon, he would transform women's wardrobes. An empire of style began that rainy day. She entered life as a royal daughter. In 1915, Alexandrine Irene of Prussia was born. She had Down syndrome from birth. Society often concealed children who were different. Noble households guarded reputations with strict silence. Her parents chose another path. They loved her openly before the public. Their stance challenged prejudice in a harsh era. In Washington during 1952, a tense trial unfolded. A witness appeared covered by a sheet. The cloth concealed identity from public view. The case centered on serious drug trafficking charges. Threats of retaliation weighed heavily on testimony. Justice required anonymity to protect the speaker. Sometimes truth survives only behind hidden faces. Freddie Mercury left most of his estate to marry Austin. He often called her the love of his life. Though openly gay, their bond remained profound. In his will, he expressed deep devotion. He believed she would have been his wife. She stood beside him through illness and decline. After his death, she guarded his ashes privately. Some relationships defy simple labels.